crush on the Mona Lisa. Photobomb. Her tits enraged the robot pelicans. The sports magazine photographer had assured Agatha that painting her breast to resemble grouper would be subversive and sexy, the best way to make herself stand out in the annual bikini issue, which, because of the increasing prevalence of body painting, really amounted these days to the illusion of wearing almost nothing while actually wearing nothing. She shook her head at the hopeless confusion of the average masculine libido. When she started modeling in high school, in Calabash, North Carolina, she thought she had come to grips with how cravenly imbecile the male sexual impulse was, enabled by what in college she would learn to term a patriarchal culture to be absurdly considered both normal and helpless, and as good as the human condition can get. Ever since then, she has occasionally had to reevaluate her initial judgment in ways that were even more not in the favor of men, or at least the sorts of men who would want to look at pictures of her, or the women who would want to imagine themselves as her in lingerie catalogs, or the men who borrowed those catalogs. Understanding all of this as the consequences of her occupation had occurred to her long ago. She didn't mind that these men and women wanted the work for which she was paid, merely for being beautiful and accommodating and generally commodified. But this? The photographer had been persuasive. So many spreads were devoted to exotic locations in which the models were surrounded by exotic squalor and cheerful, picturesque, exotic poverty, steamy, exotic tableaus in which the models would gaze at the camera in high-resolution, abstracted looks of vague sexual longing, or maybe just hunger. But Agatha's spread would be set in the port of San Francisco, where, literally, tons of seafood ships out on boats, where the cranes would swing laden with cargo, where across the marina, baseball games were played in the Macrocorp Park. The concept was to shoot Agatha on the port with the stadium visible behind her, and the coup de grace was supposed to be the flight of the Macrocorp Pelicans. These were designed by Macrocorp engineers as an iconic unofficial stadium mascot. The engineers became celebrities for not only designing artificial intelligence that could survive almost autonomously, but also for the design of synthetic feathers that would allow these birds to both fly and swim. Their nests, perched in an outer portion of the Macrocorp Park, were recharging stations for their batteries. A religious group protested the hubris of creating new life, but the group gave up after a week of being ignored by baseball patrons. Environmentalists complained that this new species would interfere with the ecosystem by endangering the population of normal pelicans, not to mention the seals, fish, and microorganisms in the bay. What seemed to make the general public fond of these 24 androids was their laps around the stadium during the 7th inning stretch. First inside the bowl of the park, over the baseball fans, who would arise in a wave to get a better look at all that flapping plastic. And then the robot pelicans would swoop over the lip of the park and fly twice around it. At one point, the birds would form into the Macrocorp logo. The photographer said that the theme of the spread would be San Francisco not as a romanticized, iconic American city, but as a true crossroads of cultures and history. The photos would include the fish market, an Asian import wharf, and of course, baseball. The photograph meant to anchor the shoot was a photo through the fish market in which Agatha was sitting cross-legged on a piling, her breast two lifelike grouper heads, with the market scene in medias res, while the pelicans swerved overhead into a gorgeously melting San Francisco dusk. Agatha said yes. In the tent, the airbrush artist awaited her breasts. Agatha removed her top and sat down. The man wore a smock, black latex gloves, a surgical mask. Pigments in miniature jars and hoses and fixtures stretched on the table. All ready, he asked. Will it smudge? Only if you move before I finish. I won't. The tiny nozzle swept around her breasts in a sticky mist. She could hear the dim crack of a bat and cheering in the distance. Foul balls could land onto the canvas ceiling of the tent. The photographer stuck his face inside. How long, he asked. 5 minutes. With a miniature paintbrush, the artist added some yellow for the gills of the grouper. With the air hose, he made a few lariats of brown and white, and then started packing up. Agatha stepped to the mirror. It only occurred to her then that the grouper is an ugly fish. With a broad, fat-lipped grimace of a mouth, her areolas in disguise. The artist had hidden her own convexities and concavities and created the sensation of the curvatures of the fish. Its dorsal fins rose like mohawks to her shoulders, like the straps of a bikini top. Is this a good idea? Agatha asked the artist. It's time, said the photographer. Agatha walked to the far side of the pier and was helped atop a piling. The crew had screens ricocheting waves of light as the sun groaned towards the sea. A nearby radio was broadcasting the game. The crowd was audible on the radio and from the stadium itself. Cranes still moved cargo on the periphery. Agatha looked at the photographer, and his lens gazed back at her and her grouper. She could hear the click of his shots. Top of the 7th inning, 2 outs. Arch your back more, said the photographer. Among the onlookers behind the ropes, a man with a duffel bag and a baseball cap smiled at her. He looked like he could be a ball player, a big torso, a square jaw, and nearly bulbous cheeks. A dull pop sounded, with more cheering. It's starting, said the photographer. The air was golden and blue and gray. Journey's lights oozed through San Francisco. The robot pelicans lofted from their perch and flew over the park's walls, which made the fans shout in a Dopplering swirl, and then the birds arose over the wall and zoomed in formation around the structure. The photographer's camera clicked staccato as the avian droids pitched over the pier and then revolved around the stadium once more and formed the Macrocorp logo. The crew applauded as the noise of lights drowsed to its harmonic epic close and the stadium began murmuring. The pelicans, though, did not return to their roost, but flew around the stadium a 3rd time, plunging upon the pier and circling Agatha like a tornado of toys. The cellophane of their lower beaks twitched, unable to emit the clucking squawks of actual pelicans. The crew cowered down on the planks of the pier. Agatha bunched up precariously on the pillar, unsure of how to defend herself. The photographer's camera continued to click. The birds turned closer to Agatha and began to slow down and hover, those synthetic feathers catching air. She could feel the little gusts upon her flesh. And then a bird darted at her chest, trying to collect one of the grouper. She shoved him off her thigh, and he fell into the bay. He swam below her, shaking his plastic head. The next bird to charge was interrupted by the crack of a bat, wielded by the man from behind the rope. The wounded robot pelican's feet were askew. Its pouched beak looked bent. The other birds started to land upon the pier around the injured one. Agatha jumped into the man's arms and slid down until she was on her feet. I'm sorry, said the robot pelican. You see, we cannot eat food. You can talk, Agatha said, absently clutching the breast that had been bitten. Were you programmed to talk? No, he said, but must we live our lives, only being who we were programmed to be? No, said Agatha. Hope not. Please take this awkward situation as a compliment. You just looked so delicious. We are not programmed to speak, or to eat, or to dream. But here we are on this beautiful, if confusing evening. I'm sorry if Harold hurt you. Harold was now dripping beside the bird, and then in unison they ran down the dock like clumsy planes on a runway, flapping until they lifted into the sky, to return to their home atop the baseball stadium. Thank you, said Agatha to the man, for saving my fish. My pleasure. Can I borrow your bat? She asked. Sure. Agatha took the Louisville Slugger and gripped it with both of her hands. She walked down the pier towards a photographer as 40,000 baseball fans started to roar.